The afternoon of August 3rd, 1944, brought with it an oppressive humidity to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's eastern headquarters, hidden deep within the forests of East Prussia. The concrete bunkers designed to withstand Allied bombing raids trapped the heat like ovens, making the already claustrophobic rooms even more unbearable. Inside the main conference room, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke in the accumulated tension of men who knew they were losing a war but dared not speak the truth aloud. Adolf Hitler sat at the head of the massive oak table, his posture reflecting the weight of recent catastrophes. The bandages on his right arm, injuries sustained in the July 20th assassination attempt barely 2 weeks earlier, had been changed that morning, but the tremor in his left hand had worsened noticeably. His face, once animated with manic energy during military briefings, now bore the pallor of a man who slept little and trusted no one around him. The surviving members of his inner circle maintained careful distances, each man acutely aware that proximity to the Führer could prove dangerous when bad news arrived, and bad news was arriving with increasing frequency. The courier who entered the room was young, perhaps 22, wearing the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht Communications Corps. He snapped to attention with parade ground precision, extending a sealed envelope toward General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command. The seal bore the insignia of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of German forces in the West, and the classification markings indicated maximum urgency. Jodl accepted the envelope with steady hands, though those close enough could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he anticipated nothing good from its contents. He broke the seal with deliberate care, unfolded the message, and read it through once quickly, then again more slowly. The transformation in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of the jaw, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of his shoulders, as if bracing against a physical blow. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the usual background sounds of the headquarters, the distant clatter of typewriters, the murmur of staff officers in adjacent rooms, the footsteps of guards outside, seemed to have been swallowed by an expectant void. Everyone present understood that messages from the Western Front had become uniformly grim since the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th, but something in Jodl's reaction suggested this was worse than the usual litany of retreats and casualties. Hitler's voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse and carried an edge of barely controlled impatience. He demanded to know the contents of the message, his good hand gripping the edge of the table with enough force to whiten the knuckles. Jodl cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his trained military voice stripping the words of emotion but unable to diminish their impact. General George S. Patton Jr.'s 3rd United States Army had become officially operational on August 1st. The American general whom German intelligence had spent months tracking and whom they believed was positioned in southeastern England to lead the main Allied invasion at Pas-de-Calais had instead materialized in Normandy. More than that, his forces had already achieved a breakthrough of catastrophic proportions at Avranches, a small town at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, and were now pouring through the gap like water through a shattered dam.
The intelligence estimates were staggering. Patton's armored columns were moving at speeds approaching 40 miles per day in some sectors. They had already liberated several major towns, captured thousands of prisoners, and were spreading across Brittany and toward the heart of France with a momentum that German commanders on the ground reported as simply unstoppable. Units that attempted to establish defensive positions found themselves outflanked before they could dig in. Reserves rushing to plug gaps arrived to find that Patton's forces had already passed by, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Hitler absorbed this information in silence. His face cycled through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, calculation, and finally something approaching despair before being forcibly suppressed. He rose from his chair with visible difficulty. The injuries from the assassination attempt and the accumulated strain of 5 years of total war evident in every movement. He approached the large map of France mounted on the wall, a map that had been updated that very morning with the latest position markers. The blue symbols representing Allied forces had multiplied exponentially in recent days. But it was the cluster of markers indicating Patton's Third Army that drew Hitler's attention, like iron to a magnet. They formed a broad arrow thrusting south and east, each day's advance marked with dates that documented a pace of operations the German High Command had believed impossible for a modern mechanized army to sustain. Supply lines that should have constrained any conventional force seemed to pose no obstacle to the Americans. The traditional military wisdom that armies required pauses for consolidation, for regrouping, for allowing logistics to catch up with advance units, all of it seemed irrelevant to Patton's methods. Hitler's finger traced the blue arrows on the map, following their paths with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The strategic implications were immediately obvious. Patton's advance threatened to encircle the entire German Seventh Army. If the Americans continued their eastern sweep, while British and Canadian forces pressed from the north, they would create a pocket that could trap hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers. The disaster at Stalingrad loomed as a precedent too terrible to contemplate repeating in the West. The Führer turned back to face his assembled officers, and in that moment, those present would later recall that they saw something they had rarely witnessed in Adolf Hitler: genuine fear. Not paranoid anxiety, not frustrated rage, but real fear.